firstly, from my side, really big thanks for joining to listen to this talk today. It's obviously my opinions and my views. I'll share some theories and things that I found relevant to me. I'll give some experiences, but really, I think the value for such sessions really comes out when you ask questions and you engage. I think, I'm not a university lecturer. I'm not sitting here giving a module course talk through. I think we should be having an engaged discussion. And I think as a starting point, I kind of will go through kind of leadership as I see it, leadership theory, how that's changed, and what you're going to get is my take on leadership from that. So you'll understand kind of, how I see leadership has evolved, how I feel that leadership is something that it needs to be embedded in the way that we behave. And then, thinking about enable, empower, and elevate, hopefully that will kind of give some of that, I say, foundational thinking. And then we can start to go through, situational leadership, how leadership styles need to change, because to enable, to empower, and obviously to elevate, it's all about leadership and showing and leading by example and creating psychologically safe spaces. But I'll come into all of that good. Leadership for me is about being a role model. And I think it's a role model that, people can learn from, but we also need to remember there's no such thing as a perfect leader, and not every leader will resonate with every single one of us. That's why I think when we think about modern leadership theory, it's evolved into followership, and followership is another thing to think about, how the evolution of leadership. But really, to be a leader and to kind of want to, it's the starting of enabling, empowering, and elevating yourself and others. I think there's kind of 4 key things that we as leaders or nascent leaders or future potential leaders should look into. The first is that you need to make decisions that others don't want to make. I mean, that's something that we should all understand. In being in a leadership position, that's probably one of the primary things that you end up doing. You also need to make decisions that don't have emotions associated with them. Lots of bad decisions are made when we are emotionally charged and we make an emotional decision based on, let's say, something that we haven't critically assessed all of the data points and the entry points. So making emotionless decisions that are fair. The other is about showing empathy and having perspective. I think the real job as a leader about taking care of those in your charge. And I think Simon Sinek really gave a great example of this when he talked about explaining that as good performers, and I think if we think about Evalueserve's hierarchy here, as good performers, we get promoted. And you get to a point of being promoted where you suddenly start to get to the point of you are managing people who are doing the job. And at this point, the management thinking needs to change. You suddenly say, well, I'm probably better than most people doing this job because I've been promoted to the point of doing the job. And I think what you need to remember is, you move from being responsible for the job to being responsible for those people who are doing the job. So that's probably the first point in this enablement, empowerment, and kind of elevation. So what I was saying is, you get to that point of, rather than being responsible for the job, you start to become responsible for the people who are doing the job. And this is really that first point of how do you start to enable and empower? If you start to get to that thinking mindset where you're telling that person, no, you're doing the job wrong, you're making a mistake, this is what you need to do. You're not explaining to them and showing them and allowing them to play and to test and kind of learn. You're actually taking away that first step, that enablement and empowerment. So, the first step of a leader, as I see it, really is to start to say, stay late sometimes, work a little bit hard, show people what to do. Don't tell them, show them, let them go and play. And when they get it wrong, and they will get it wrong, don't get angry, but say, try again. I mean, that's to me, the first step of leadership is changing the mindset. Of course, when we get to principal consultant, when we get to an associate director, we've all gone through that role. Myself, I was an FTE. Long story. I might get into it if we've got time. My first out of university, I was an FTE. And as you start to go through that learning cycle, you've got to flip the thinking from one point, from just being, I'm good at this job and I can do it better than you, that's why I'm in this position, to saying, okay, I'm now responsible for people who are doing the job, and my role is now to help these people to do the job better and to learn and impart the knowledge and to really take them on that journey of learning and sharing. So I think that's where it goes. And I think what we should also think about is that leadership does come with personal sacrifice. And when we think about personal sacrifice, personal sacrifice is quite a big thing to think about. But when it goes wrong in leadership thinking, you know, as a leader, you have to take all the responsibility. But then just 2 seconds, when you think about then things go right, you also have to give away all of the credit. You know, you're not in that position of saying it's about me. And I think learning for me about good leadership and bad leadership, I've had some fantastic leaders who have enabled me, enriched me, and really helped me to learn and put me on my trajectory to where I am today. But I've also had leaders who, when others in the team, when I was the IC, I was the individual contributor, who really took every single responsibility for everything that me and my teams were doing, said, it's me, I'm the leader, I'm the best, it's all because of me. And actually that's not true. And that's just something which I think, you know, as a leader, you've got to sacrifice that. You've got to sacrifice that it's not about you, it's about your team. Your team always win. But when they lose, you've got their back. You know, it's about you. You take the responsibilities and what you could have done something better. And I think that's when we think about this enable, empowerment, and elevate, it's about enabling and empowering at that point. You're enabling and empowering people to feel comfortable making decisions. So we should also remember, like, not everyone, what I've said it before, you know, not everyone wants to be a leader, not everyone should be a leader. To be a leader it does come with a personal sacrifice. It does come with other things associated to it. You know, you are a figurehead that sits there that has to make decisions that others don't want to make. You have to take these calls. And I think that's not something that everyone is comfortable with. And I'll come on to that in a moment, why, and kind of some of the leadership failures I've seen, especially when you get into this kind of empowerment phase. But we should start to think really how leadership theory has evolved since the 80s and 90s, how we've shifted from kind of resource capital personnel management of the 80s and 90s. And we talked about, you know, let's say, how do we get the highest level of productivity? Productivity is important, but I think we got to think about people as people. And I think by understanding collective leads of people within an organization, you start to move to more of this followership. You start to move to people who want to elevate and support and work with people who are similar to them. Now, we also need to remember that everyone has choice, and choice became more prevalent to all of us, especially in our organization, in the pandemic. You know, in a pandemic situation, leadership is even more important, and leadership is also about changing. You know, I personally see leadership as being the representative member for the people, and to enable, empower, and kind of elevate your staff. You know, you have to think about what is it that they need, what do they want, but you need to make the decisions based on the collective needs. You can't make a decision that's going to make every single individual happy. And I think that's the first thing that I would always kind of say to anyone. You know, when you sit in that leadership position for that first time, how can you enable your team to be better? How can you do all these things? You're trying to make every single person happy. You're going to fail. Actually, you're going to fail pretty big. You know, I think that's something you've got to be comfortable with. Sometimes there's a decision that when you're managing 10, 20, 30, 40, 1,000, 4,000, 10,000 people, you simply cannot make decisions that are making everyone happy. You've got to think collectively the needs, and then are you making the collective right decision? And then coming back to the pandemic eras, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic recessions, global situations that we see. Leadership isn't about saying you've got one style. And I think you think about the workforce, to use the term, and the teams and the individuals that we have, the personalities that we have, your teams, your colleagues, the people, they're all mums, dads, sons, brothers, sisters, they're people, and they all have different needs and requirements. And I think in different situations, different environmental impacts, you need to start to pivot. Your leadership style can't always be autocratic. Your leadership style can't always be democratic. You can't have this kind of laissez-faire approach always. You can't always just rely on charisma. You know, depending on the situation, depending on the environment, depending on the time and the need of the hour, you need to pivot and you need to be able to change. Now, to pivot and to change, you need to have feedback channels. And a feedback channel is one thing that I would say is as important as creating psychological safety. So really you need psychological safety to create the feedback channel. But by a feedback channel, you need to have people who will tell you absolutely what you are doing wrong, not what you're doing right. I mean, that's when you're in a leadership position, most people will tell you what you do right. It's what you do wrong. And you need that mirror. You know, these feedback channels, people who say, I disagree with this, I think you're completely wrong, I think you've missed something. And you shouldn't be arrogant enough to ignore those. You should listen. To me, actually, the best calls I have is not when I get this, yes, you're doing great, thank you. I really, it makes me feel great. You know, as a human, being told you're doing something great is so enriching. But actually, as a leader, being told that I'm doing well, that's the one I want to pause. Okay, what did I say that didn't land? How am I doing things which could be better? And I think you're never going to get that feedback channel if you don't create psychological safety. And psychological safety comes onto some kind of ERG theory, which I'll touch on briefly, but you can obviously Google it and read about that more. But I think psychological safety is a basic need. You know, people in a working environment need to feel safe. They need to feel respected. They need to feel that they can talk and be themselves. And it's amazing how many teams, environments actually can, not through fault, but that just don't create that kind of environment. If you're not creating a working environment where people feel they can say and share something very, very openly, transparently, that they're not happy, they're conscious about something, they want to share a concern, you're not going to be getting the true feedback channels, because no one, I don't care who you are, no one is perfect and no one does a good job all of the time. And if anyone starts to hear that and see that, that's when you start to get this missteps in management. We see it in world leaders. I'm not going to get into politics and world leadership, but if we just look at some of the issues we've seen, when you start to surround yourself with people who just tell you yes all the time, you are doing a great job, this is great, you start to make the missteps. And this happens in leadership. And it happens then when you start to lose that psychologically safe space where people feel comfortable, you then start to lose the feedback channel. And then obviously, you know, the ERG theory talks about, you know, creating safety, but then creating belonging. So when you've created an environment where people feel happy to share, they feel safe to share, they feel belonging, but you also start to feel that they can grow because they can share, they can take things off their plate, they can start to discuss things, and then they get into this growth phase.
I would like to know that most leaders, if they do ask questions also, or any one of us, how we ask is important, because if you just point blank, you ask, okay, any feedback for me? Then invariably the person will probably say nothing, yeah, all good. Yeah, so there you would have to, there has to be a mechanism, a process, or something set up, right, where you genuinely want feedback, not for motivation, not for the, for some, where you, it's like a good ego massage motivating me, but where you really genuinely want it, and there has to be a mechanism where maybe you're scheduling some time for it, because that's other. And the question also has to be indirect, like if you were the project manager, if you were the person doing it, how would you do it differently? You know, perhaps that's another way of, you know, asking, and you'll get so much feedback on you.
Yeah, because you're so right, Noreen. If you just say, what am I doing? Oh, all good. No, it's great. I mean, just keep doing what you're doing. Okay. So I think you're right. You need to ask those more direct questions. What should I change? You know, you could do the stop, start, continue. That's basic. But if people start to know you, and I think about having a relationship, and it's about feeling comfortable with you. I think modern leadership to me is not about sitting in an ivory tower. I think the minute you create division, you create this, you sit in somewhere, you're all detached from the people, you don't sit and work with the people. I mean, for me, whenever I come to our India office, you know, I make sure that I sit on the floor, I sit with the people, I go out with the teams, I do the BYOC, you know, bring your own coffee. I think we changed the term to, I did chai time last year, and connecting right from the RA right up to obviously AVP, sorry, director, associate director level, VP level. So I think creating this environment where everyone feels they kind of know you and they can see you is very important. And not taking things, sometimes, you know, I think I saw Alex's point, you know, feedback can come from the most unexpected source. Absolutely agree. I think I've had, and out of respect for the person, I won't share it, but it had some great feedback, absolutely brilliant feedback in the lift, going from the ground floor to floor 10, on Tailforce. Someone, like, we were talking and I asked them, and they gave me something about some social media posts that I gave, and I thought their feedback was spot on. And I said it was brilliant feedback, and really, I think that, Alex, to that point that you just raised, it can come. It was probably not the feedback I was expecting from that person at that moment in time, but I absolutely valued it. Some of the decision making that I make seems sometimes obvious to me, but actually when I start to talk through it with people, it's like, okay, this is very, very interesting to hear this from someone when they didn't understand or didn't see it that way. So taking time to, I think, as we're seeing, to connect and to really talk to people and to just kind of say, okay, connecting is the big thing. Taking time to connect is so important. Absolutely. Leadership is about communicating and not just sitting in a session and saying, this is what I do. I think saying it is one way, but doing it. And I'll use Mahatma Gandhi as an example. His style of leadership and enablement and empowerment and enrichment was really by doing it himself first. He didn't say, you should do, I'm sitting in an ivory tower, you should do this. He never said that. That's not at all. He did it himself. He led by example. He led absolutely in a completely, he showed up, I will do it. I will live this lifestyle. I will show you. And I think when we start to make that back into Evalueserve context, we talk about feedback cycles, we talk about using cameras on calls, we talk about returning to office, we talk about responsiveness. I'm not going to get into some of the bigger topics potentially, but if we take those ones, if the leader, and the leader can be at any level, the leader doesn't have to be the LOB head, the EVP, the leader can be at any level. If that leadership layer aren't doing and living by it, how can they hold others accountable? It really does become a question. And I think I don't want to kind of open up a can of worms on this call today, but I think leading by example really is probably one of the biggest things that I would say. No one will ever do what you're saying unless you're doing it yourself and really doing it, not just doing it once, doing it twice. You are living, breathing, and doing those things, and people will really understand it and do it. And I think as a leader, you need to understand you have a leadership contract. And I think a lead, and again, it comes from, it's a part of a business school type of theory, but you're in a position that requires you to make fair, unbiased decisions that you will be held accountable for. I mean, you're also obligated to take decisions and also to live with the impact of your decisions. You need to keep learning and evolving with the business. So when people talk about leadership theory, leadership thinking, leadership is linked to change management, and some people see change management, you start change management. Well, I think that I don't agree with that at all. I think change management is just something that is happening. The world is continually changing. The world is continually evolving. All of us have seen significant changes in the last 3 years, let alone the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. And if you start to understand that everything is changing all the time, the needs of your staff are changing. The hiring requirements, the hiring situations, the working environments are changing. I think change management doesn't need to become something that we do. It's about something that is embedded in the way that you think as a leader, and you're continually staying ahead of things or up to date with things. And as I said about feedback channels, as part of your leadership contract is accepting negative feedback. When you're making these collective decisions, people are going to be unhappy. Some people will be unhappy, but you don't just ignore that or shut it out or talk it down. Give people the space, listen to people. You don't always have an answer. You can't always say, oh yeah, but you should have, you can. Sometimes people don't need that. As a leader, you just listen sometimes. And sometimes it's just giving people the space and the air to talk and acknowledging it and saying, I appreciate your feedback. I can't change the decision, but I appreciate you taking the time. It might not be what they wanted to hear, but it's also about giving them that opportunity. And then really, I talk about it a lot, and I talk about it on my LinkedIn posts as well, but this authenticity and this being genuine, we're not here, if talking about fellowship as leadership, we're not here to get likes as leaders, right? We're not here to get likes on what we do. It's about being here to be authentic and just showing people genuinely who you are. And if you're not that person, you don't believe it, don't say it. don't pretend to do something or say something if that's what you can't do. So coming back to leading by example, you can only truly lead by example if it is you and it is your personality. And if it's not you, then reflect on the leader that you are and the leader you want to be, and what steps you need to make and change to get to being the leader that you want to be. Because the leadership journey differs for every single person. And as I said, not everyone wants to be a leader, but the leaders that you then want to work for, you want to be with, how could you be around such people to kind of enable you and empower you better? I think I've covered just thinking, when I talk about critical thinking, active listening, all of these things, you can never enable people to be better than you and to grow if you're not active listening. Actually really pushing people to the forefront when they want to be. There's those who will want to be at the forefront who shouldn't be. So it's about this balancing act. The one who says, me, I need to talk. That was me, by the way, sometimes. Just, full disclosure. Is that the one who should always be at the front? Maybe not always. The one who's quiet has probably got quite a lot to say. So how do you create a sharing feedback loop, a cycle where that person also can share and genuinely get that information out and push that person to the front? And how do you do it in a way that they feel comfortable? You can't necessarily always do it in an open environment. Tell them to stand up on stage. Let's hear from you. Come on, chat. That person could have very, very uncomfortable.
How do you deal with two leaders pulling in different directions when you have a group of leaders in a room and all wanting to lead or show leadership, and probably there's a power struggle there?
Very difficult question, but I think, how do you do it? I think there's ways that, first of all, by creating that psychologically safe space, Alex, I think is the first place where people feel that they can talk and share. And I think the first thing, when you get to that, people feel they can share, you start to have this communication. Why are people pulling in different directions? I mean, getting to that communication and starting to understand, what is it? Why are you pulling to the left? Why are you pulling to the right? Really starting to understand that and creating that. Maybe it's something that you can do collectively as a group, but if that's going to become potentially confrontational, you could also do it in an individual setting and then start to give the feedback in a group setting. But I think the first is, don't try to challenge it necessarily, but try to understand it. What it might be is that they're not wrong, maybe that there's actually lack of clarity. We've made lots of changes recently in Evalueserve. And when I started having one-to-ones, I suddenly saw that it was clarity that people lacked on some of the decisions. When I spoke to them and we had a conversation, actually with that lack of clarity in the communication, it landed. Suddenly there wasn't the problem. And I think that could also be the situation, and it's when you've got such a room, you just need to have these kind of conversations and very openly.
There's another question. Yeah. So this is more in terms of, for our immediate reportees, you do have trackers, and as a manager, you'd have trackers, you look at it. However, do you have a tracker or evaluation of the decision that is to be made, if it's right or wrong, for managers, the management team, the leadership layer? So that's again,
do we have
how
trackers?
Do you go about your deliverables? How do you manage that, is what the question is, in terms of, you do have for the analysts and maybe senior analysts and all of that, but for the leadership layer?
Yeah, actually, do you know what? I'll share this. This is good, because yes, first of all, we do. And let me explain to you what it is. So we have a balanced scorecard at BSC, and the balanced scorecard is shared with all of the EVPs. Out of confidentiality, I won't go what's in the balanced scorecard, but every single LOB head has the balanced scorecard. And what we have is actually shared with the whole layer. So everyone within the ELT understands what the balanced scorecard is of every single person within there. So as a leadership layer, we understand the impacts of what we do and the requirements of the others. So actually, you start to have this situation where you understand how people understand how you're going to hit your target. I understand how they're going to hit their target. So you start to collectively pull together. So trackers and balanced scorecards and different KPIs are all the way throughout the system. I think the way that we do it in the ELT is this transparency. When in my LOB, we've created something called a group head. We've basically gone into more of an industrial setup. And again, I've shared the KPIs are completely transparent with all. Everyone knows everyone's KPIs, and everyone knows what's good. And we then have trackers, we have meetings, we talk about revenues, we talk about all of these, the core KPIs that are there. We then assess performance in that collective way. Now, can you do that with junior analysts, senior analysts? Of course not. But I think having transparency around what KPIs are, the purpose of KPIs, and the fact that they do go all the way up to the executive leadership team would probably be a positive thing to do.
All right. The next one is, again, you started off by saying, right, as a leader, one should not take decisions under emotions. Obviously, we do have emotion in check, but how does empathy, play there, and how do you detach yourself, the balance that you have to bring in decision making and the collective decision making of the greater good, because we can't please everyone. So you might want to sort of at least add more light to it in terms of, we don't mean that just be devoid of, emotions and
you don't become a robot.
That's impossible.
No, you don't become a robot. I think what you've got to remember is that people, as a leader, you start to get pulled by different people. People will try to partition you, lobby you, right, in some ways for different things. And I think what you've got to do when you're making a decision is to consider all the data points. And then what is the objective that you're trying to achieve with the decision making? So if you're trying to achieve, objective A, well, what is the best outcome for objective A, given the data points and the information that you have at hand? Taking out all subjectivity, taking out what's best for you personally, what is best to get that objective achieved. It's one of the hardest things in leadership, because as a human, we always want to do things that some way, subtly, maybe positively, is best for me. And I think it's probably one of the hardest challenges as a leader, that you are trying always and checking and challenging yourself. Do I benefit? And is this truly the best decision to make for the organization, for this decision, for this question that I have? It's hard to do. And again, you're always going to upset potentially some people in it. But I think as long as you're open about it and you share the decision-making metrics and the way that you approached it and the decision making, right, then people will normally accept it. I think when you suddenly say, look, it's this, you're autocratic, it's this, it's done, I'm not discussing it, it's done, we're not discussing it, then you're creating more of a problem. So I think, because then no one trusts the decision, it's that black box decision making. So sharing, look, this is it, but actually based on this objective, the best thing that we've decided to do is this. And most people will accept it, but I think it's hard to do. It is hard to do. I mean, it's something that I'm still learning to do, because obviously we all have this self-protection, right, where we want to say, that's going to be negative for me. Let's limit my personal impact here. And I think you've got to really try and step away from that and understand when you're doing that. Once you start to reflect, and I think one of the big things of leadership is reflection. I talk about it a lot to my direct reports about reflecting. And I think for me, reflecting is looking at a situation or a decision that you've made and really starting to say, what was the situation? What happened? What was my role? What would I do differently next time? What would I do the same next time? And what have I learned? Now I actually write these things down. I don't know if that's just me, but sometimes I find my style of learning and reflecting is to suddenly write these things up, just very loose. I'm not sharing them with anyone. This is just helping for me to kind of get it out of the brain to the hand. That process of brain to hand kind of helps me then really look back. Very long answer. Apologies.
All right. So another question we have is, okay, selflessness and empathy are the two things required, but do you think it's possible to enforce accountability?
Yes. I mean, you've got to have accountability, because otherwise you're living. I mean, you can't have a situation where people aren't accountable. So I think if you think about does everyone know a RACI matrix? Responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. I'm sure most of us will know that. I think the way I have it in a lot of our key decisions in business is talking about a RACI matrix. So we talk about who is the accountable, who is the responsible, who is consulted, and who is informed in this. And I think by doing that, you're showing to a broader team the accountable and the different layers and how feedback should flow and how things should work. And at that level, I think it is quite easy to enforce accountability or responsibility. But it needs to be enforced, and the person who's being told to be accountable or responsible should understand why. And they should also want to to be responsible or accountable. I think when you get to that point of trying to enforce it on someone and they don't want it, then I would say you need to take a pause and reflect. Maybe it's time to give that to someone else. Understand why this person doesn't want it, and if this person doesn't want that, then don't try to force someone to do something they don't want. They will never do it.
Right, and then there's some, if you have any recommendations for books, maybe that we can take from you later. But yes, there's another one which is
I've
very...
lots of books.
Yes, there's a very interesting one, and this reminds me of Susan Cain, who's written Bittersweet about the world of introverts, rather. So we have a question here that, it's a world of just people who want race to talk more, sound more like a leader. So, how do you sort of, become a strong leader who's somewhat less vocal?
Okay. I mean, I'll give an honest answer. I'll give you my personal answer to this as well. Okay. We live in the world of social media as well. So there's the spoken word and there's the written word. And you can lead. I mean, leading is probably doing what I'm doing today, standing in front of a camera and talking. But you can also lead in your actions, in what you write, in what you do, but also leading in terms of doing a good job. I mean, if you're really showing in your work, in your output, in the way that you engage, over email, it doesn't have to be on calls and in team settings, because you're not maybe the most gregarious, charismatic or outspoken person. That doesn't matter. It doesn't mean you should be held back. I think in this environment that we're in now, it's more always about assessing the impact. So you've got social media, which is obviously written. Maybe people aren't comfortable with putting their views and opinions out there, which is fine. I mean, as a company, we do try and promote that. I know in my LOB, we're really trying to promote actually spotlighting individuals at all layers within our organization to show the industry that it's not about me at all. I'm the least important in that sense. It's about the team. It's about everyone that we've got that makes this great. So that's one. And then I think in terms of the way that you do the work and the way that you flag it off, a good leader should recognize that. So if you've got a good leader and someone who is happy to make you accept, can actually accept that you're doing a good job and not trying to take the credit for you, that should also deplete that need to kind of, or that problem if there's a gap there. But I mean, if not, I think, being just very genuine, flagging off where you can, and really just being very open as much as you can in written, in email, in calls with your RM is a way to go about it as a starting point. But it's something that you can learn. I think there's lots of courses about speaking, about communication styles. I mean, I mentor lots of people inside Evalueserve and outside Evalueserve, officially and unofficially. And I think when you start to get to that communication and how you communicate, it's really the critical point within business. There's kind of 3 different levels to communicating and how you do it. And I think you've got to get comfortable at speaking your mind, and you've got to get comfortable knowing that you probably aren't always going to be right, but you're still comfortable in sharing an opinion. It's like today, I'm not saying this is gospel what I'm saying, this is just my opinions, and if people don't agree, I totally respect that. I'm not going to say that I'm right, it's just my opinion.
There's one which is, I'll leave it to you. Should we as a company aspire for principles like pay transparency and equal pay for equal work? And I think Rajat has also responded that as a participant, saying that we already have an equal pay for equal work in many of our operating geographies. Otherwise, it would be discriminating if you don't follow it.
Exactly. So I think you don't have pay discrimination. I mean, there's bans. So let's talk about this. If we're not in a situation where everyone at every level in the organization is paid exactly the same. Of course we're not. There's different levels of experience, different levels of knowledge, and people are at different levels in their journey. So you might have someone who's at a consultant level who's just started, and someone who's going towards the end. So there'll always be a band. But I think payments within the bands is something that, of course, we have, because to the number 2. I'm sorry, I don't know. I can't see the name of the person who wrote it, but to the person who responded, absolutely, it is a crime not to do these things. Especially when you start talk about on equal opportunity as employer. If you think about the awards and the recognition that we've got as Evalueserve, there's certain requirements and prerequisites that we have to fulfill. Now, do we want to publish everyone's salaries? I don't think we do. Personally, I think if we did that, you're going to create disharmony and problems more than you would create opportunities. I think that what you would create is a situation of potential collapse, because you're always getting to this personal thinking. So you're thinking again about me, not what's best for the company. So you're starting to say, well, I'm better than this one. I'm better than this one. This one shouldn't be earning more than me because of. And I think the thing is here, you've got to be comfortable with where you are. And I think you have to be, do you feel that you're getting fair pay for fair work? And if you're not, then that's something which I think you need to, I would turn that question around. Why don't you feel you're getting fair pay for fair work? Where do you think you can get it better? What are your concerns with this? So I would turn the question around a little bit in some ways, but it's obviously a very personal one as well.
And there's another one. How do you develop and drive thought leadership apart from experience that comes with time? How do you make the learning curve steeper to grow as a thought leader 10 times faster?
Sharing, communicating. I think the more that people communicate, the more that you speak up. And let's take it in, and I can talk only here because I can't talk on behalf of all Evalueserve. I can talk really on behalf of my LB and what we do. We can take someone from a level 4, someone who's a consultant level, and we can say, right, let's publish a paper from this person. We can work with them so they can have an editor who can start to tweak and adjust and explain to them, okay, I would change this way and this way. So start to help to guide people in that thought leadership way of writing, talking. Then it's also about training yourself. If you take when you did your first degree, when you do your first degree, you really just have been learning theory, and then you get to the point of practical application once you graduate. Then when you go into kind of higher education, you go and do an MBA or you do something else, you start to get into using the practical theory, so the theoretical side and the practical application, and then challenging it and starting to say, well, this theory is wrong because you can't actually apply this theory in this way. So that starts to help you bring out thought leadership. Now you can accelerate that by understanding from experiences. You can read about experiences, but having an opinion. And I think having an opinion is something you're not a thought leader without an opinion. Just regurgitating others' views is not giving thought leadership. So I think I would spend more time reading on this. I would also spend more time trying to get your opinions out there, testing them, testing what lands, what doesn't. And when it doesn't land, start to then come back and say, okay, what did fail there? What should I do differently? Why didn't it land in the way I did? And then that feedback channel that I talked about, if you're sharing these initial ideas with people, make sure you've got people who are going to give you balanced, honest feedback. And they'll obviously be able to help and accelerate that, because then if you start to address those and don't take out the emotions from the feedback, then you'll obviously hopefully accelerate that learning.
And then we have some comments about, I think leading by example is another way, relatively less vocal leaders can create impact, which is again what you said, action speaks louder than words, so yeah, so that's there.
Absolutely.
And there's a lovely question, Debasmita. We would want to know suggestion regarding, transition from an individual contributor role to a more team-oriented leadership role. Something we talked during the day, manager, and transitioning to a leader's role. Something on this, because sometimes it's not at all seamless, simple. So any tips on that?
I think it
from
comes
an
back to
IC role
first
to
point.
A team-oriented role.
Yeah, it comes back to that first point I probably said about you've got to the point of being a leader because you're very good at the job. And I think you've got to get to the level of acceptance that you're no longer responsible for the job, but responsible for the people who do the work. And, it's really, how do you start to explain and articulate how to do the job, but without saying, give it here, I'll do it. I think the minute you say, give it here, I'll do it, you're not actually helping and being a leader anymore. You're just taking over. So I think you've got to learn that actually, as you step up, you've got to make that break and say, okay, I'm no longer responsible for the job. I'm responsible for the people who do the job. And as you go higher up, you become responsible for the people who manage the people who do the job, and then the people who manage the people who manage the people. So it goes, and I think you've got to accept at each level what the requirement is. And I think that first step is probably the hardest into leadership, when you start to let go of doing all of the work and you start to enable others, train others, let them make mistakes. Even when you're seeing them, don't say, oh, you've done it wrong. Stop, halt, don't do that. Let them make the mistake, then go through that conversation with them. Why did that happen? Did you think about this? Don't tell them next time you should. Because actually then you're blocking that positive. I would say, how would you do this differently? Was there another way that you thought about doing this? Now, obviously on a client deliverable, I wouldn't do that. I would do this kind of as you're going through the work. Don't just say, hey, I knew it wasn't going to work. We sent it to the client that way anyway, because Justin said on a leadership chat, let the person fail. Please don't do that, right? I think it's doing it in that safe way. And as people are learning, you've got to let people learn. And then when they've done that, let them, make sure that they're part of that kind of feedback loop, that they're giving you their views and why they did it, and you're not shooting it down. And then I would literally turn around and say, try again. I've got your back. Keep going. And they might help you learn as well. They'll probably give you feedback that helps you become better in the way that you do things.
Thank you. And we have Rolf asking, will you be taking some of these sessions in London when we have the office in London? So yes, I think, or you could,
sure.
What's stopping you? Have your team sessions, with your...
Sure, Ralph, no problem.
All right. And then there is a question from Simardeep. Who inspired you? And this is lovely because talk from your experience. So who inspired you to the thought to give credit to your team for the success and taking the blame for the failure? So it's like, okay, let's go ahead and let's crash this out if there's an error. So any personal experience you'd like to share on this, where there was some.
No, happy to. So the first, and I won't name people. I'll name the positives, not the negatives. Okay, just from a point of being nice. So before I joined Evalueserve, I had some very, I would say, managers, not leaders, who I worked for. And if you remember when I mentioned about people taking credit for the work that was being done, we were a team that had this big character. It was all about them. And I'm just going to say them, right? It was all about this person, this individual. And when I always had a vision that I wanted to be in leadership. And I've always, just to share something personally, I've always drawn out a career plan. I've always looked at where do I want to be in 5 years? And I've always drawn out a career map of where I want to be in 5 years and what do I learn? So I've always mapped that out. And I always thought that's an example of a manager that I don't ever want to be. And then there's other people who have done things in terms of not telling the truth, creating silos of information. There's lots of things that I've seen very bad. Bear in mind, I'm 42, so I've been through this kind of, I guess, some quite interesting people who have come from all the 80s, 90s management culture, very hard-nosed, very kind of autocratic, and you learn a lot from those individuals. I think in terms of inspiration, in terms of being more transparent and owning my own mistakes, it would be when I joined Evalueserve. Actually, my former boss, Urs Doman, who did my job before, was one of the best. He really enabled me to see, actually, it's better for you when you make other people great. And credit to him. He made me, obviously I took over his job, so credit to him in terms of the learning that was there. So I don't want to, there's no sports star or celebrity. It's just normal people in work actually have more impact on your life and your performance. And I think that we always worry about, if this one gets ahead of me, it's going to be negative. It's never going to be negative. Having people who are better than you is a wonderful thing. I think you should never try and hold people back. You should always promote people up, because in the end, when as managers, as leaders, you always should look at who's creating the fastest growth in their team, who's creating the next level of superstars. And you should really start to try and promote that and understand that more. When you've got one person who's the center of attention, and if this person goes, the team collapses. Without going into the HR side of it, that's always a flag.
All right, Ashish Patra has, sometimes you cannot share or be fully transparent about certain decisions. How do you handle that as a leader? And Clinton has, of course, responded as a participant. In that case, you can be transparent about the fact that you have the information, but are not at liberty to share. So you'd let them know some change is coming, but you can't share it right now. So please add on to it if you want to have anything else you'd like to add to it.
There is, and I think there's also ways that you can back channel information, and when I mean back channeling, I'm not talking about saying, oh, don't tell anyone, but not that. There's ways that you can start to, when you get your feedback channels in place, and I think one thing I have in my LOB with my direct reports is I have a very transparent feedback channel. And I think Ashish, you obviously work with me very closely. So Ashish, you know me well. I think, when you start to have these feedback channels where you start to just drop bits of information into people, how would you feel about this? You start to gauge, but you're also starting to take away the shock. Now it's something that has to be very delicately done and learned, because there's certain things, I can't remember who said it, you just simply can't say this is going to happen. I mean, you simply can't do it. But there are points when you can start to prepare people. Look, something's coming, the reason for this, and always talk about why it's happening. But yeah, you can't always just say, look, this is happening. This person's this. Then, as a leader, you need to think about the impact of the statements you make, and you need to think about, will it cause negative impact on that person unnecessarily? And if it does, then there's probably no point in sharing it. So it's not about need to know, and it's not about creating silos. It's really thinking about, does this person materially benefit or not, or miss out from knowing this information? And if it's one way or the other, then I would think about, do they need to know ahead of time? And then think about how you impart that knowledge.
And I think we have comments here. Yeah. Yes, Megha beautifully articulated. Justin, admire people who are brighter. Yes, rather than holding them back. Yes. Consistency in decision making always helps. Ankur, delivering the right message. Okay, Nishant has a question. Have you ever been influenced as a leader by any sports team or sports anyone, though you've answered that, but anyone who's probably a celebrity, any person which is not like Uzdaman, like you gave the example, but anyone else that yes, outside of
celebrities,
or anyone, like you mentioned Mahatma Gandhi right earlier, so anyone else.
I mean there's so many. I mean, from a leadership speaking, you've obviously got political, spiritual leaders like Gandhi. You've obviously then got people who have made impacts on a professional life, people like Oz, people like Mark. There's the founder. I've been lucky enough to work with Mark and to be mentored by Mark in many ways. So I think I'm very honoured with that. I think then from a celebrity basis, there's all lots of things that you can start to learn from and pick up from. And I think, there's people like Simon Sinek. There's, you can look at, who I've talked about a few times. I've used his comments. He does some quite good podcasts. There would then be others, you've got the classic cases, the Kotlers and, the academic writers. But I think in reality, it's about you become a magpie in leadership, right? And I use the term magpie because you start to take bits from everyone, and you start to stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So you learn from everyone else and what they've done, and you start to deploy that in your own way and in your own style. And hopefully the people who are working with me now, I'm sure they're going to be 10x better leaders than I ever was. And actually, I'm actually, not that I think, and I hope they will be. Let me be more positive. They will be better leaders than I've ever been. And that's just fantastic.
As an employee, we try to be flexible as much as we can, when we try to do that. But as an organization, Evalueserve, how much of flexibility is given to employee from a management perspective, the ELT, the leadership, how much of flexibility is given?
We're a people organization. So I think flexibility, I can't comment on the individual case, because obviously as the ELT we make decisions, and how they then get at different levels, how they come down. But flexibility is key. We empower a creative thinking. We want people to come forward with ideas. It's not that it has to come from the next level down. I think, when you see the way that Ravi, that Nand, that the other LOB heads engage, it's not just peer-to-peer, it's across the organization. And I think that's the way that we try and, imbibe this flexibility and this level of kind of thought sharing, knowledge sharing, flexibility in doing things. Everyone should be given some space to learn. I think when we look at the time allocations, there's obviously a learning element to everyone's time. And then there's this, people should also have time to think. You learn, you think, you apply, you adapt, you learn again, you learn a bit more. So it's like that learning circle. I just saw one comment about Alex Ferguson's book. I think Anchor made pushed that up. I think I like that. The only thing I don't like about Alex Ferguson's style, and I will say it, is he talks about leadership being respect, and it talks about there's love and hate, and he does talk about it's about respect. The Harvard study on it, and I think I quite liked it, but I think it's also he's saying that you have to give him respect to get respect, and that's the only thing. And I think I don't know that quite follows modern management, in my view, potentially. That's just, sorry to add a comment on there.
So we have one question. How do we handle a scenario in which a team member is not willing to accept any improvement is needed in their behavior when clearly the performance at the client project is reflective of several behavioral traits which are affecting the client relationship?
My humble guidance is speak with HR. And I mean that because one thing I don't want to give the advice immediately here, but there could be things that you need to understand. Maybe things that, in terms of the way that you've been giving information to that individual, it hasn't landed in the way their interpretation, they've deciphered the information incorrectly. But then with HR, remember we have a network and a system here to support you. And when things don't go right and you need support, HR are here to help you. Again, it's another data point, it's another data node. You can take that in, speak to your RM as well. And I think between your RM and HR, you should be able to get to some level of decision making. Doesn't mean that we go PIP and these things. That's a last outcome. We should always be trying to positively improve things through conversation.
It's not rare for leaders to not delegate, almost as if holding on to responsibility defines their position. What do you do in such a situation as a leader?
Do I delegate? Of course, yes, I delegate. Yes.
Yes. But, yeah. Sometimes it's not to delegate, but then you at times you hold on to it also. So how do you probably have that balance here?
It depends on what's needed. So I'll talk about an active case, and I'm cognizant of time, but there's a budget submission that I have to do for my LOD next week with Tal, the CFO. Now I won't delegate that. That's not something I delegate. That's something that I will write and I will do that myself. There's other pieces of work, and then there's other things where we look into, let's say, the utilization and impacts on, let's say, mischarge codes. Those things I will delegate because there's better people to answer the question. I think as a leader, you've got to understand that you can't take every single thing onto your plate. There's people who are better at doing it and have the knowledge readily available and can give you a better output. So let them do it. But then you also have to understand where there's certain things that you have a requirement for the position and title that you sit in to do that piece of work. I think it's just reflecting, taking a pause before you delegate always and say, is it right that I delegate this, or should this sit with me? Or is there someone better?
Do you think good leadership can be affected by a rough client? That's the last one, guys, and we will... A
rough client. I think clients are people. And I think what we shouldn't do is put clients on a pedestal. We shouldn't try and bring them down and say, hey man, you're the same as me, don't speak to me like that. I think there's a balance to this. We need to have respect. Like there does need to be respect, and there needs to be in the way we talk and react. But I think at the end of the day, a client shouldn't be talking negatively to individuals. Now, in my previous roles, I'm sure if you look at my background, that I've been a CE, I've worked in sales, I've run the sales team. I have actively picked up the phone and spoken to clients because I did not agree with the way that they spoke to the staff. And I have put clients straight, to use a term, many, many times, because I think they need to remember that we all are in this together, and you need to have common decency and to treat people like a human. There are people on this call who actually know I've done that, and I've done that with them and for them. So, and I can see their names, so that's up to them to comment on it. But I think it's something that a bad client can definitely derail things. But then I think it's about the support network that you have and the way that those people support you. If someone says, hey man, you're on the call, you deal with it, your problem, that's not right. And as a leader, you should say, this is not acceptable, I will now take this up. And then as long as you're making emotionless decisions with the facts only, then you can have that conversation. You can challenge the client. And I've done that. And when I did that to the client said, okay, you're right, I apologize. And they wrote a letter, they wrote an email apologizing to that individual, and they reflected on the way that they spoke because of the emotions of the situation, and they realized they'd made a mistake. But it's about doing it in that very unemotional way. If you do it emotionally, then it's going to blow up and it's going to cause chaos. But being controlled and just talking about facts.
Yeah, so I think thank you, Justin. But if you have maybe just 3 things you'd want to, just when it comes to your team members, how you want to elevate them at the end of the day, empower, enable, and elevate them. Just 3 things that you want to just quickly say, and then we'll close this conversation.
Yeah.
We're already 4 minutes, just a minute more.
I think the first is, create and this is down just off the top of my head, I think create a psychologically safe environment in your teams. You can do this in any team. You can do this in your project team. You can do this as a leader. You can do this at any level. Create a space where people feel that they can genuinely share with no impact on their career. You're not going to say, hey, I didn't like what you said, so you're not going for that. That's not what you do. You need to make people feel they're safe to share. The next, I would say then, is create the feedback channels and the loops. Allow people to feedback to you, have conversations, and have perspective. Have perspective on the decisions that you make. Have perspective on what you're saying and the impacts that has. And always just take out these emotions and balance in decision making. They might not be the best 3, but they're the first 3 that came to my mind when you asked me, Marie. So I would really thank everyone for staying that little bit longer, and really appreciate everyone's time. So thank you so much, everyone. Honoured to be asked, and great privilege on my side.
Thank you. And you will have one due for the London office. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, guys. Appreciate the time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.